Chapter 1. A teapot, lid and whispered gossip. The village of St. Mary Mead wore its autumn dress with quiet dignity. Smoke curled from the chimneys, the hedgerows burned with scarlet berries, and the church bell marked the hour in its measured tones. At the corner of the high street, the little toy shop with its bow-fronted windows glowed warmly, stuffed with wooden dolls, clockwork trains, and puzzles that gleamed beneath the lamplight. It was on such a crisp morning that Miss Marple, shawl drawn neatly around her shoulders, strolled past the shop on her way to the post office. She paused, knitting needles peeking from her bag, as she noticed a curious detail: a broken teapot lid lying on the toy shop's doorstep. Odd, was it not? A piece of crockery out of place in a shop that dealt with toys. She made a mental note, as she always did. Inside the post office, Mrs. Hartnell was already gossiping in her shrill voice about a missing letter that should have arrived from London, but hadn't. "A terrible business, I say. Things don't just vanish," she told anyone who would listen. Miss Marple listened with her mild smile. She had a way of listening that drew out more than people meant to say. One might almost think her distracted, but her eyes missed very little, and then quite suddenly, the whole village was shaken by the discovery. Mr. Timothy Blaine, the toy shop owner, was found dead behind his counter. "Murdered," they whispered in hushed tones. The police, of course, would be summoned, but in St. Mary Mead, everyone's first instinct was to speculate. Miss Marple bent her head, knitting once more as she thought. A broken teapot lid. A missing letter. How curious indeed. What would you do if you noticed such a clue on the toy shop step? Would you dismiss it or keep it tucked safely in mind? Cliffhanger, the first clue of candle wax is yet to come. Chapter 2. Candle wax in the dark. The toy shop had been cordoned with a sensible strip of police tape that fluttered rather apologetically in the autumn breeze, refusing to be dramatic even for the sake of tragedy. Inside, however, the drama had already occurred. Mr. Timothy Blaine lay in the back room, covered now with a respectful coat. The front of the shop, bow-windowed and gleaming with tiny faces, stood very still, as if all the toys had agreed, by silent pact, to hold their breath. Inspector Graves, a broad-shouldered man with an unromantic moustache and an affection for rules, stood over the counter with a notebook. He had the look of a man who believed in lists, and in points beneath those lists, and perhaps in sub-points too, if pressed by circumstance. "No one touches anything," he declared, not unkindly to the cluster of villagers who'd slipped in with the same stealth as a draft. "And that includes your eyes, Mrs. Hartnell?" "Eyes cannot touch," Mrs. Hartnell returned, but she lowered hers all the same, an expression of thwarted innocence plastered on her face. "It is merely that I am helpful by nature. I observe. I report." Miss Marple, perched on a little wooden stool near the puzzles, raised her knitting just enough to be exemplary. "One learns so much by not touching," she murmured, and set a stitch neatly in place. "It is the quiet things that tell you the most." If she glanced past her needles toward the counter's shadowed edge, it would have been only to note a faint glitter there, a puckered waxen sheen where the lamp would not quite reach, a small crescent smear pearly in the dim. Candle wax? But why candle wax near the till, and a good 2 feet from the fat red candle that sat decoratively untouched on the display? Was it carried here? Dripped by someone moving quickly, hand unsteady. Did you catch the detail about the candle wax? You might ask yourself. If a candle was lit, then time may have been measured or hidden. Who would want to hide time? Inspector Graves crouched. "Sergeant, mark this spot," he said to a younger man with nervous ears. "This wax shouldn't be here." From the doorway came a gentle clatter. Lucy Blaine, the dead man's niece, had stumbled against a tin train. She was a pale, slight girl with auburn hair pulled into an anxious knot and a habit of holding her breath just before she spoke, as if words might be fined for leaving unescorted. I didn't know you'd let people in, she whispered. We haven't, Graves said, almost kindly. But your presence is understandable. Family. I may have questions. Miss Marple regarded Lucy over the silver gleam of her knitting needles. The girl's gloves were knitted too, fawn wool with a small nick near the thumb. On the palm, just there, a faint smudge as if she'd pressed her hand to something tacky and pale. Candle grease will do that, especially if one grips a taper too hard. Of course, young ladies like candles. There is nothing remarkable in the act. Still, why would Lucy avoid looking at the tidy splash of wax by the counter? Mr. Dawes is in a temper outside, Mrs. Hartnell announced, with the delighted shock of one reporting thunder directly over the rectory. The postmaster, you know. He says Tim Blaine owed him 2 months' receipts for remittance orders. Tide you over, he told him. But it seems the tide simply rolled away. Mr. Dawes may wait, Inspector Graves said, without looking up. He went on making his list. Found at scene candle wax, 1 broken teapot lid on the doorstep, cash box closed, till tally to be checked. No sign of struggle in the front. Broken teapot lid, Lucy echoed, startled. But Uncle Timothy kept a teapot in the little kitchen, not here. Quite so, Miss Marple said, sounding as if they'd been discussing the proper length of a tea cosy. Why would anyone break a teapot lid, do you suppose? Carelessness, of course, is the usual answer. But sometimes a lid is used to muffle noise or wedge something open or even... She let the thought rest, neatly folded like a napkin. It will be interesting to see the pot itself, the sergeant called from the open back door. So, footprints, muddy. They run from the yard to the threshold. It rained earlier in the evening. Whoever came through, well, they were in it. Inspector Graves straightened, face sharpening. Boot size? Hard to say. Medium. Prints are messy. Could be a worn sole. Do they run both ways? He asked. The sergeant hesitated. It's odd, sir. It looks more as though someone made a show of going in. Not much coming out again. The mud thins quickly. Staged, perhaps, Miss Marple murmured, mostly to her yarn. One sees that in amateur theatricals. The curtain is always tugged too hard. She looked up, kindly. Who do you suspect now? The one who leaves footprints, or the one who knows better than to leave any at all? Reverend Pritchard arrived then, breath clouding at his lips, coat slightly too large for his earnest frame. He removed his hat with solemnity. My poor child, he said to Lucy. I came at once. Mrs. Hartnell drew herself up. It is not seemly, Reverend, to hurry so. Appearances matter. Truth matters, he said simply. Which, Miss Marple reflected, was exactly the sort of remark to irritate Mrs. Hartnell beyond reason. And an irritated Mrs. Hartnell was a very productive thing indeed, for she dispersed her vexation like a thistle blowing seeds, as if summoned by the promise of seeds. Mr. Dawes shouldered in with a bristling dignity that fell short by an inch. He was a square man built to fit a counter, with a hairline that had retreated prudently and a temper that rarely did. If there's to be a counting, he announced, I insist upon being present. He owed me money, and will not have the ledger conveniently vanish. Inspector Graves gave him a cool look. I'll speak with you outside. Outside? Dawes scoffed. So the vicar may be in here, but an honest tradesman outside, the inspector repeated, guiding him with a hand that had its own mind. Miss Marple watched the little procession through the window. Graves, firm and judicial. Dawes, spitting like a kettle at full steam. The sergeant doing his best to grow into his ears. Then she rose delicately from her stool and drifted to the corner where the wax gleamed. A toy soldier stood nearby, red-coated and tinny. Another lay behind him, toppled on its side as if exhausted by the effort of holding a pose. On the floor, just at the lip of the counter, another faint drop, the tail of a drip, led inward. Did you catch the detail about the candle wax? She might have said aloud, had anyone asked her opinion. Wax does not run uphill. Someone stood here with a candle and something to do that could not be done in full light. The broken teapot lid returned to mind. Miss Marple considered the ways of lids. They are very good at keeping in steam and very good at being put on or taken off quietly if one has respect for the pot beneath. They also make a useful little shield if one is prizing up something stubborn and does not know about knives. From the back room the doctor emerged, grave and quiet. "Time of death between 8 and 10, he reported.
"I can't be finer until tomorrow. Blow to the head, back of the skull."
Heavy blunt edge. "Not a fall, then," Graves said, re-entering after a brisk conversation with a still seething Dawes. "Right. We'll canvass for who saw him last. We'll check telegraphs and letters. And no one is to repeat hearsay about curses, ghosts, or the like." His eyes flicked warningly to Mrs. Hartnell. "Curses?" Lucy whispered, blanching.
"Well, what curses?"
Mrs. Hartnell, scolded but undeterred, lifted her chin. "There is talk, only talk, that some of the old toys he bought last week came from File Manor, where an unfortunate governess is said to walk. She was wronged, they say. And her toys, taken without proper reverence, might—" "Ghosts," the Reverend said dryly, "are a convenient explanation when one dislikes the living." Miss Marple gave a small, approving nod. Yet it is just such gossip that is useful, she thought, for it gives the wicked a veil to stand behind. Who benefits from talk of a haunted doll? Perhaps the one who hopes we'll look there, and not at wax on a counter. Chapter 3. The footprints at the churchyard morning came in a pale shawl of mist, softening roof lines and turning the church spire into a quiet finger pointing heavenward. St. Mary Mead does not clatter into day. It clears its throat and puts the kettle on. In the vicarage garden a robin hopped about with proprietary importance, and along the path behind the toy shop the previous night's mud had settled into a darker map of intentions. Inspector Graves returned at first light, boots decisive upon the lane. Miss Marple was already abroad, ostensibly to take a little air, but in truth to see what the air might quietly say in return. She greeted him with a small, useful smile and directed her attention to the ground. There, along the narrow run of cobbles leading from the toy shop's back door, the muddy footprints remained in imperfect procession, good enough to be noticed, not good enough to be helpful. "Do you see?" she asked softly, as if speaking to her knitting. "Whoever made these wanted to be seen. That is always interesting." The sergeant crouched, squinting. "Half-sole, sir." "Bits missing at the heel." "Planted," Graves muttered.
"A masquerade in mud."
"Mark the pattern anyway. And where do they go?" Miss Marple wondered aloud, letting the question drift like steam from a teacup. "To the churchyard, I think."
"One always goes to the churchyard when one—"
"Wants an audience of stones and no questions. They followed the lane past the vicarage hedge, the vicars, roses hanging their heads as if politely avoiding the scandal, and through the small wicket gate into the churchyard. The prints thinned where the grass began, as prints always do when they no longer need to convince. A rook called once, irritably, from the yew, "Here, sir." The sergeant pointed to the shadowed edge of a family tomb, Blaine, as it happened, in modest lettering, and to the base of the church wall where rainwater had made a shallow rut. A scrap of paper lay there, not white, but a blue so faint and familiar that even Miss Marple, with no love of office fittings, recognized it. The corner of a blue envelope torn along the gummed edge.
On the scrap, a faint impression of a stamped crest, Garrick and Hollis, solicitors. "A missing letter," Miss Marple said pleasantly, as if remarking that dahlias were late this year.
And now a missing envelopes corner to keep it company.
How obliging of the world. New clue, did you catch it?
A solicitor's envelope torn in haste. Who receives such letters? Those with inheritances, debts, wills, or old obligations that refuse to lie down. Inspector Graves sealed the scrap in a glassine sleeve with a sigh that said he did not care for obliging worlds. "We'll pay a call on Garrick and Hollis." Miss Marple's gaze moved to the church door. The brass offertory box beside it showed a faint, milky smear along the keyhole, an almost translucent crust with a petal of ash adhered. Candle wax again, but scented faintly when she leaned nearer. Lavender, not chapel beeswax. It takes so little, a small spill upon a gloved fingertip, a thoughtless touch to a lock. Did you catch the detail about the candle wax?
She might have asked you.
It travels like gossip, sticks where it shouldn't, and betrays the hand that carried it. Vandalism? Reverend Pritchard had come quietly to the porch, his coat shrugged on as if in apology. He bent to look, troubled. Nothing appears taken. We keep the box emptied. Mrs. Hartnell, who has a way of arriving exactly where the richest cream of conversation is being poured, materialized at the gate with a wicker basket and a face of sugary concern. But attempted theft is theft at heart, Reverend, and so near your door. Shocking. Inspector Graves straightened, and for a moment the morning light hardened his moustache into a line of authority. Vicar, I'll need your keys and a list of who has copies.
And, if you please, the times you were out last evening. My keys are here, the Reverend said mildly.
You may see them. As to last evening, I visited Mrs. Gooch at 7. She has gout and loneliness in equal measure, returned by 8:30, wrote a few notes for Sunday, and slept by 10. My housekeeper can attest to the first.
Only Providence to the second, Mrs. Hartnell sniffed.
And what of the sermon you drafted last week, Reverend, on deceit prospering for a season?
Remarkably apt, wouldn't you say, given Mr. Blaine's circumstances?
Madam, said the Reverend, Scripture's aptness is not my doing. How quickly suspicion sows itself into any parish fabric.
Red herring or righteous doubt, what do you think?
Footprints toward the church, a wax-smeared lock, and a vicar with access after dark. Who do you suspect now? Miss Marple's eyes, meanwhile, had gone to the vicarage side path. 2 narrow ruts scarred the damp earth where a barrow had passed recently, the sort gardeners use to cart compost or firewood. The tracks bit into the soil, then faded upon the gravel. A small thing, perhaps, and yet small things sing in harmony.
Near the hedge, she stooped and lifted a length of plain brown twine, kinked where it had been knotted.
At one end clung a tiny rectangle of card, Blaine's Toys. 3D, the strings smelt very faintly of paraffin and lavender. Another new clue. Why should shop twine scented oddly lie by the vicarage hedge? To snag itself in a rose thorn, the way guilt snags in a conscience, or to be found precisely as it was meant to be.
Ran out of kindling, did you, Vicar?
Mrs. Hartnell inquired, with the innocence of a cat asking after cream. Your man pushed a barrow past my window late last night. My man is a pensioner named Mr. Lydon, who comes Tuesdays and Fridays, the Reverend replied, unoffended. Today is Thursday. So it was you then, she concluded, satisfied. Miss Marple let it float by. People who want to be right will always be.
One must sometimes let them and learn the more.
She turned back to the Blaine tomb. Low upon the stone, where a hand might rest for balance, there ran a pale scratch, gritty with chalk dust. If a person had hidden something under the slate margin, they might carelessly scrape the surface with whatever tool lay nearest. A shard of ceramic, perhaps, about the size of a teapot lid's broken edge. Why would anyone break a teapot lid? To wedge open a swollen drawer? To lever up a floorboard or a stubborn lip of stone? Or to silence the clink of metal on stone in the small hours when a candle trembles and a heart goes fast? "Sir!" the sergeant called again from the lich gate. He held up a tiny stub of candle pinched between forceps. Its wick was flattened sideways, as if snuffed by gloved fingers in haste. The wax was white, and when Graves held it to his nose, he grimaced.
Lavender. The same. Mrs. Price Ridley uses lavender tapers in her drawing room, Mrs. Hartnell announced, gallantly enlarging the circle of implication. And so does Miss Blaine, if I'm not mistaken.
It keeps moths away. Lavender keeps many things away, Miss Marple said, smiling sweetly. Unfortunately, it does not keep suspicion. They made a small procession through the village before noon. the inspector to the toy shop for a fresh tally, the sergeant to take statements, the reverend to his rounds, Miss Marple to her kettle. Tea, you must understand, is not only for comfort, it is for clarity. The steam rises, ideas condense. While the kettle purred, Miss Marple set out her modest harvest. The blue envelope corner, the twine, the scent memory of lavender wax, the scratch of ceramic on stone, the wheelbarrow ruts, the smear on the offertory lock. Each bit lay separate, respectable as parishioners in their Sunday pews, and each, perhaps, connected by filaments too fine to see at once. She thought of Lucy's gloved hand with its pale smear.
Candle grease?
Face cream? People mislay gloves when they wish to be believed harmless, she murmured, threading her needle. They also tighten knots too hard when their nerves are poor. At 3:30, Lucy came for tea by invitation, bringing with her a face newly washed of tears and a composure that did not quite fit. She accepted a scone, declined jam, and ate as if fulfilling an obligation. "My dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "you mustn't try to be brave for bravery's sake. It's very tiring, and crimes are better understood when one is comfortably seated." Lucy smiled, a small effort.
I hardly know what I'm doing from hour to hour.
The doll gone from the window, it felt like a message. Uncle bought it only last week from File Manor. Everyone kept looking at its eyes. People always look at eyes, even when paint is doing the seeing, Miss Marple agreed. "Tell me, did your uncle expect a letter from Garrick and Hollis?" Lucy's teacup rattled faintly in its saucer.
What makes you think?
"Their envelopes are notoriously blue," Miss Marple said, buttering crumbs. "It's a rather vulgar shade, but solicitors are rarely blessed with taste." "I don't know," Lucy said after a breath. "He spoke vaguely of paperwork. If there was anything about the shop, about ownership, he never told me plainly." "Who benefits if there is confusion?" Miss Marple asked lightly. "The scrupulous or the quick?"
Uncle Timothy trusted the wrong people sometimes, Lucy said in a rush.
"He thought kindness paid dividends, but it only seems to collect debts." "Kindness does pay," Miss Marple said, very gently. "It simply pays in a currency murderers cannot spend." Dusk gathered with village punctuality. Lamps winked on. Curtains were drawn like respectable eyelids. The wind lifted the last leaves from the plane trees along the green. Miss Marple, who has never been sentimental about safety, took a shawl and went out once more as the hour approached 10. There are things the day refuses to say. They speak after Compline, when even gossip draws breath. The toy shop stood dark against the lane, its bow front reflecting a slender crescent of moon. Inspector Graves had posted a constable at the corner, but the man, poor soul, had drifted 3 steps off for a warming rub of hands. Miss Marple slipped by with an air so ordinary that even rules made polite way for it. She paused at the side alley, listening. From the low vent of the toy shop cellar there came a thin, tremulous thread of scent, lavender again, newly woken, and with it the softest whisper of air that comes when a flame eats what it does not deserve. Candle. A candle burning where no light should be. "Did you catch that?" She'd ask you if you were at her elbow. "Lavender and a little draught. Someone's below with a taper." She stooped by the grill. A faint glow pulsed along the stone like a nervous heartbeat. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw it. The shadow of a hand moving across the far wall. Careful, deliberate, holding something small and rigid. The outline wavered and, curiously, bulged at one end as if cradling a round lid or a shallow bowl. A floorboard creaked lightly behind her. Miss Marple did not turn, for the foolish always expect you to whirl. The wise know to listen. She kept very still, shawl blending with the stone, and watched the candle flame quiver below. Inside the cellar, something clicked, metal on wood. Then the faintest rip of paper freed from a tight secret place. The shadow paused. The candle dropped fractionally. The smell of lavender grew sweet and cloying. And then, from the darkness under the shop, a voice no louder than breath said, Got you. Chapter 4. The Curse of the Wooden Doll. The village never stays silent for long, not even in the presence of death. By the next morning, St. Mary Mead was humming again, not with bees in hedgerows, but with words flitting between doorsteps, post office counters, and teacups. And all the words seemed to circle one object, the vanished doll. It had been a curious thing in the shop window, no taller than a foot, stiff-jointed with painted red shoes and eyes that caught the light oddly, as if glass had been set too deep into the sockets. Timothy Blaine had purchased it from the sale of File Manor, where, as Mrs. Hartnell now reminded everyone with grim relish, a governess met her end most unpleasantly on the stair. By 10 o'clock, half the village was whispering that the doll was cursed. People said its eyes followed them, Mrs. Price Ridley confided over her counterpane, to which Miss Marple listened politely while straightening a tasselled edge, and that Timothy shouldn't have brought it into the village at all. Bad luck comes in trunks and chests, you know. Like moths, Miss Marple inclined her head. Indeed, bad luck does travel, though more often in pockets, I've found, and at the invitation of human hands. Still, a rumour once loosed will not be caught again. By luncheon, the doll had grown a reputation fierce enough to rival the church gargoyle, and some swore they'd seen it move in the toy shop window the night before. Such stories, Miss Marple thought, are a red herring set by fear itself, yet they provide excellent smoke for a thief to slip through. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, had little patience for curses. He had summoned Lucy Blaine to the station, where she sat pale beneath the gaslight. "You told me you came only to look in the window," Graves said. "But the constable swears he saw you by the back alley."
"Which is it?"
Lucy twisted her hands. "I walked round. It was foolish, I know. I thought if I looked inside, perhaps Uncle's keys might have been left." "Keys?" Graves leaned forward. "Yes," she admitted, voice thin. "Uncle always kept a spare set for the cupboards. I thought if I had them I might keep things safe." Miss Marple, present by courtesy and courtesy alone, smoothed her gloves. "And what cupboards in particular would you guard, my dear?" Lucy flushed. "The cellar."
"Uncle said it was damp, but he kept papers there. I wanted to be sure no one rifled them. Interesting."
Why should a girl in shock remember cellar papers? Unless she knew of the missing letter and its value. Miss Marple stored it away, like a stitch to be returned to later. That evening, with rumours thickening, Miss Marple walked the high street. A faint drizzle turned the cobbles slick, and lamps cast their usual modest glow. At the post office window, Mr. Dawes scowled over ledgers, the angle of his shoulders betraying strain. "You'll have heard, Miss Marple," he said when she paused politely, "that Timothy Blaine owed me. Now they'll call me heartless, pressing the family for dues. But let me tell you," he tapped the ledger. "He signed a note. He promised remittance. Without that I'm ruined. Debts do weigh upon men," Miss Marple said kindly. "But it is curious, is it not, that the missing letter might have touched upon ownership of the toy shop? An inheritance, perhaps. Such papers often lie with solicitors. And solicitors' envelopes, I hear, are blue." Mr. Dawes started as if pricked. "If such a letter existed, I've never seen it." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured. Yet she thought of the envelope corner found at the churchyard, and of Mr. Dawes's profession, guardian of letters, keeper of keys to messages. Who better to intercept a missive than the man who sorted the post? At supper, Mrs. Hartnell had already embroidered the tale of the doll into fine tapestry. "They say the governess's spirit seeks revenge," she declared, to the small group gathered in the snug of the Crown.
That Timothy Blaine carried her doll, and the doll carried death.
Why else would his teapot lid be smashed, his shop dark, and his life ended within days? Why indeed? Miss Marple murmured, sipping weak tea, unless a human hand, perhaps impatient for profit, hastened matters. But one must never dismiss a teapot lid too quickly. Teapots do not break themselves, the inn's regulars chuckled nervously. One man swore he'd seen muddy boots trailing toward the church again at dawn. Another claimed the vicar had been abroad late at night, though Reverend Pritchard himself denied it stoutly. A red herring swam merrily through every sentence, tangling truth with gossip. "Who do you suspect now?" Miss Marple might have asked, had she been inclined to break the rhythm of talk.
Lucy, with her nervous secrecy?
Dawes, weighed down by debt? The Reverend with wax near his lock? Or some other hand, quieter still, who used gossip as a cloak? The real turning came 2 days later. Inspector Graves called Miss Marple to the toy-shop cellar, now unlocked for full search. The air was musty, alive with the scent of damp stone and lavender, still faint though the candle had gone. Against one wall stood a stack of wooden crates labelled File Manor Auction. Graves pried one open. Inside lay toys, a tin carousel, a box of dominoes, and beneath them scraps of paper charred at the edges. Miss Marple bent delicately. "Part of a letter," she observed, "half-burned. See the seal here, Garrick and Hollis again." She lifted a charred strip where words still clung.
Ownership of premises. Transferred niece Miss Lucy Blaine.
So, a missing letter indeed, and one that made Lucy heir to the shop. If Timothy had hidden it, perhaps uncertain of revealing it, then someone else had been very eager indeed to make sure it vanished. Inspector Graves turned grim. If Lucy knew this, she had motive aplenty. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "My dear Inspector, motives are rather like knitting wool. One must be careful not to tangle them before the pattern shows. Lucy might benefit, yes, but would she burn the very letter that proved her claim? Would you?" A pause. Even Graves looked thoughtful. As they turned to leave, Miss Marple's keen eyes caught one last curiosity. On the stone step, where dust had settled thick, a shoe print had been preserved by chance, a sole with half the heel missing. She bent, peered, and smiled a little to herself. "Not so staged this time," she whispered. She rose, shawl drawn close, and let her eyes travel over the dark crates, the charred papers, and the faint trail of lavender wax. Someone had been here, rooting by candlelight, desperate to conceal truth, yet careless enough to leave whispers behind. Above, the toys in the shop stared through glass eyes into the village evening, and in the gossip rising anew of curses, governesses, and haunted dolls, Miss Marple heard only the steady breath of human frailty, hiding behind superstition. Cliffhanger. That night a scream echoed from the green. Another villager had been attacked. Chapter 5. Tea with Miss Marple. Mary Mead has always believed in the restorative power of tea. Even the most scandalous whispers, when set beside a proper pot and a plate of scones, shrink into something manageable, like a cat rolled up by the fire. And so, in the wake of another scream on the village green, Miss Marple did the only sensible thing. She invited Lucy Blaine to tea. It was a mild afternoon, the mist having lifted, and the little parlour at Miss Marple's cottage glowed with homely neatness. Embroidered cushions were plumped, lace doilies perfectly straight, and the tea set gleamed with a polish that would have made Mrs. Hartnell sniff in approval. Lucy arrived pale, her auburn hair loose from its pins, eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. She perched on the edge of the armchair as though expecting interrogation. But Miss Marple poured tea with serene calm, added milk just so, and placed a scone on Lucy's plate with quiet finality. "There now," Miss Marple said gently. "Eat a little. The body grows stronger before the mind will follow," Lucy tried. She broke off a crumb, then another, and finally took a sip of tea. Her hands trembled faintly as she replaced the cup. "You've been through quite an ordeal," Miss Marple went on, her voice soft as wool. "Your uncle's death, the missing letter, the gossip about cursed dolls."
"It is enough to frighten anyone." Lucy's eyes widened.
"The letter, so you know?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, half the village knows by now. Gossip travels faster than the post. But what matters is what is true. The letter said the shop was to be yours, did it not?" Lucy hesitated. Yes, Uncle wanted me to have it, he told me once long ago. But he said we must wait for the papers.
I never saw them until the inspector showed me the burnt scraps. Her voice shook.
Why would anyone burn my letter? That, Miss Marple said, stirring her tea, is the very thing we must discover. While Lucy gathered her courage, Miss Marple observed small details with eyes that never rested. The girl's gloves folded in her lap bore faint smudges, still that same tacky shine, as though candle wax lingered, and Lucy avoided them, glancing instead at the window as if the garden roses offered safety. Miss Marple asked, in her mildest tone, "Did you light candles in the shop, child?" Lucy flushed. "Only once. Uncle let me tidy after hours sometimes. He hated the smell of paraffin, so I lit lavender tapers. They kept away dampness." "Ah," Miss Marple set her teaspoon neatly aside. "Lavender wax is indeed familiar." Curiously so, Lucy looked stricken. "You don't think—" "My dear, I think only that candles leave traces and traces tell stories." She patted Lucy's hand. "It is very difficult to erase what wax wishes to remember." After Lucy departed, calmer for having spoken, Miss Marple received another caller, Inspector Graves himself, notebook under his arm. He declined tea at first, then accepted, and sat stiffly on the edge of the chair, as though tea with Miss Marple were an official duty. "We've had another incident," he said. "Henry Larkin, the sexton. Someone knocked him down by the green last night. He swears he saw a figure running with something under the arm, something shaped like a child. A doll, perhaps." Miss Marple's brows lifted delicately. "So the cursed toy is at the centre again. How obliging of it," Graves frowned. "Don't tell me you believe in village tales." "Oh no, Inspector."
But I do believe in people using tails.
"They are so very convenient." He cleared his throat. "Your thoughts on the suspects?" Miss Marple folded her knitting calmly. "Well, Mr. Dawes is very vocal about his debts, which makes me wonder if he protests too much. Lucy, poor child, gains the shop, but hardly seems the sort to burn her own letter. The Reverend has lavender candles at hand, though I cannot see him skulking with dolls. And Mrs. Hartnell knows everything about everyone, but murder requires more than gossip. One must look for the hand that moves quietly beneath the chatter." "Which hand is that?" Graves demanded. Miss Marple smiled. "Why, that is for you to discover."
I only notice things like wax smudges twined by a hedge.
"Or footprints that try a little too hard to be seen." That evening, Miss Marple entertained Mrs. Price Ridley for a short visit, as one must to keep gossip sweet. The woman rambled about haunted governesses and the dangers of buying toys from grand houses. "Of course," Mrs. Price Ridley concluded triumphantly, "the doll is clearly possessed. Why else would it vanish from a locked shop and then appear under the arm of a shadowy figure? Mark my words, Miss Marple, it will walk straight back to File Manor before long." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said mildly. "Or perhaps it will walk where profit leads it." "Profit?" Mrs. Price Ridley was scandalized. "One cannot sell a cursed toy." "Ah, but one can," Miss Marple said gently, "if one knows a collector who pays well for curiosities."
Fear drives up prices, oddly enough. Mrs. Price Ridley blinked, then leaned forward in horrid delight.
"A collector, you say?"
Now, who in the village would know such people?
Miss Marple only smiled, letting her guest supply her own answers. By bedtime, St. Mary Mead seemed once again at rest. Curtains were drawn, lamps extinguished, cats curled on mats. Yet just past midnight, as the church clock tolled, Miss Marple sat awake in her armchair, knitting steady, ears tuned to the faintest sounds outside. From far off, across the green, came the scrape of a cartwheel, slow, hesitant, and then an echoing thud, as though something heavy had been dropped against wood. Miss Marple set down her needles, her eyes calm but sharp.
"Another move on the board," she murmured.
"And who, I wonder, will be the next to play?" Chapter 6. The second attack dawn broke wan and wintry, as if the sky had spent the night thinking ill of the village and could not quite forgive it by morning. A streak of weak gold touched the weathercock. and St. Mary Mead rubbed its eyes with the sleepy propriety of a place that prefers scandal neat and daylight watered down. News ran ahead of the milk cart. There had been another break-in at Blaine's toy shop. This time there was blood found on the cellar steps like dark punctuation in an unfinished sentence. Inspector Graves stood in the bow-fronted shop, jaw set. The constable had already cordoned the lane with a stout rope that whispered of seriousness. In the cellar below the air was sour with damp and, fainter now but persistent, the sweetish breath of lavender wax. Miss Marple descended carefully, her hand gliding along the rail the way one strokes a fretful cat. "Mind the stain, ma'am," the sergeant warned, indicating a clotting smear 3 steps down. The blood led from the bottom step to a crate and then away again, as if someone had knelt, fumbled, risen. Miss Marple noted the distribution with her ordinary, housewifely gaze.
"Not spilled and scattered," she said mildly.
"Dragged in a sleeve, perhaps? Or a nicked hand pressed to cloth?" Graves crouched by a crate, stamped "File Manor Auction." Its lid now bore a fresh crescent gouge. "Wasn't here yesterday." He tapped the mark.
"A lever used."
"Thin, hard. Like a shard of ceramic," Miss Marple supplied pleasantly. "The edge of a broken teapot lid does behave so, useful for prizing when one hasn't the proper tool." Why would anyone break a teapot lid? To serve tea badly, or to open what wasn't theirs? The crate yielded another of its reluctant secrets, under straw, and a nest of dominoes lay a stained envelope, blue once, now smoke-kissed, inside a brittle half-sheet.
On it Char had spared a line and a name, which
"Hereby bequeath the premises and stock of Blaine's Toys to my niece Miss Lucy Blaine. Signed, Timothy Arthur Blaine." Below, a second line ended in a rip, as if a name had been torn deliberately away. "The witness," Graves muttered. Paper half burned and the second signature missing. Damn cunning! Miss Marple's eye, however, had wandered to the floor. In a drift of coal dust beside the boiler lay a button, tortoise-shell large, with a peculiarly old-fashioned shank and a hairline crack. She took it up in a handkerchief. "From a man's overcoat, I think. Not new, and stitched with a heavy hand. There's a smear," she peered, "of something pale at the rim. Do you smell it, Inspector?" Graves sniffed, winced. "Lavender again. Wax, by thunder. Who walks the night with scented tapers? Those who dislike the dark, or those who want the village to remember a scent?" Miss Marple said quietly. "Clues that are too obliging ought to be given a stiff curtsy, and then asked to sit down out of the way." "Red herrings," Graves translated, "not without respect." Quite. They found other trifles that were perhaps not trifles, a scrap of brown parcel paper with a penciled sum, 18 tens, a knot of shop twine tightened viciously, and in the ashpan, the grey ghost of something once red, paint flake, perhaps as if from a small wooden shoe. "From the doll?" the sergeant breathed. "Possibly," Miss Marple allowed. "If someone scraped at a panel where red paint had caught. Dolls are so unhelpful about giving up their secrets." A knock thudded above. When they returned to the shop, Mr. Dawes waited, hat gripped in his square hands, indignation riding on the back of anxiety. "I had to come," he began before permission had been offered. "If the letter proves the shop belongs to the girl, then my note is due from her. I'll not be ruined by timidity of law." "Your solicitude is noted," Graves said. "Where were you last night between 10 and midnight?"
"At home!" Dawes snapped too quickly.
"Balancing books."
"Ask Mrs. Dawes if you doubt me." "We shall," the inspector replied.
"And your coat?" "The heavy one," Dawes blinked. "What of it?" "It's missing a button," Miss Marple said gently, and showed him the handkerchief parcel. His face flared.
"Anyone's button!" Silly thing, Snap.
"And I'm not the only man with a coat in this village." "Undeniably true," Miss Marple said, so sweetly that it did the work of a pin. After Dawes's departure, Lucy came, pale and determined, her hands working one glove into the other.
"Inspector, am I a suspect?"
She asked without preface. "Everyone is," Graves said, not unkindly. "But truth does narrow company." She looked at Miss Marple instead. "I didn't burn the letter."
"I didn't. Uncle meant me to have the shop. He said so last spring after the Easter fair."
"He only wanted to set things in order." She hesitated. "He was waiting on a witness," he said. "Someone the village would trust. But he didn't tell me the name. Who would Timothy consider unimpeachable?" Miss Marple mused. "The vicar, perhaps. Or the doctor."
Or, she paused, knitting eyebrows.
Occasionally a man chooses someone no one would think of at all, simply because that person is always present. A postmaster is such a fixture. Letters in, letters out.
"Signatures made, signatures noticed." Lucy flinched.
"Mr. Dawes?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said. Yet convenient suspicion is the cheapest kind. The day stretched thin and grey. At noon, Reverend Pritchard arrived, hat in hand, distress in his eyes. "I must tell you something," he said to Graves. "The offertory box was tampered with again in the night. Nothing taken, but the keyhole is gummy. I fear someone's using wax to test the wards. And I must tell you something, Reverend." Graves returned. "A button from a man's coat was found in the cellar." The vicar blinked, then, honest creature, looked down at his own buttons as if they might have betrayed him in his sleep. They had not. Solid horn, not tortoiseshell. He looked relieved and rather sheepish. "I was with Mrs. Gooch again until 9:30, he said earnestly. Her gout grows biblical. Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime listening for false notes, heard none in him, only discomfort, and the sort of embarrassment that comes when a man of God is made to discuss buttons. By late afternoon, the village felt stretched on tenterhooks. Children were kept within doors. Curtains were twitched. The Crown Inn did brisk trade in opinions. In that tolerant room of wood smoke and pewter, Mrs. Hartnell presided like a magistrate of conjecture. "Mark my words," she proclaimed, "the doll is the key. The governess's spirit." "Spirits don't leave her crates," muttered old Mr. Pottle, who had been a carpenter 30 years and believed strictly in nails. "That gouge is a tool mark and a sloppy one." "Who do you suspect now?" The warm room seemed to ask. The debtor with a missing button, the vicar with gummy locks, the niece with an inheritance and wax on her gloves, or someone quieter, walking where footprints pretended to but did not. Evening came early, shouldering the day aside with a draught that smelled of river and wood smoke. Graves set a plain-clothes constable to loiter near the toy shop. Miss Marple, after a small supper, settled in her armchair with knitting and patience. She had, you see, elected to wait for the thing that always returns when it believes itself unseen. Habit. Around 11 she took up her shawl and stepped out as softly as a thought. The lane behind the toy shop lay thin as a ribbon, the moon a clipped coin. She paused at the cellar grill. No glow tonight, only the old breath of damp stone, and then from the alley's mouth the scuff of a heel and the quiet, single click of a latch. Miss Marple did not turn her head. She let her eyes travel by slow degrees to the shop's back door, where, to her inward satisfaction, a line appeared, very slight, of pale grease around the lock, like a slug's trail on a summer step. Someone had daubed wax again to feel the wards. The someone slipped within, as soundless as a well-taught maid. Miss Marple counted to 30, which, in a village, is long enough for an alibi to think itself adequate, and followed light as thistledown. In the shop, the toys looked past her with immortal indifference. From below came the whisper of movement. She descended 2 steps and stopped. The cellar was black, save for a caged glow from a shuttered lantern. No lavender tonight. A wiser light. The figure crouched by the crate with the gouge, swift and practised, one hand working a thin blade beneath a slat. The other hand was wrapped in a cloth bandage darkened by an old wheel, as if a cut, shallow but inconvenient, had bled on the previous visit. The blade levered. The slat sighed. The figure breathed once, ransacked straw, and drew out, carefully, a flattened parcel wrapped in oilcloth. As it turned, the lantern angled its truth, a square jaw, a retreating hairline, a mouth pinched by debts and decisions. Mr. Dawes, he did not see Miss Marple. She had a gift for becoming part of furniture when it suited her. He slit the oilcloth. Inside lay a sheaf of papers and, glittering maliciously, a little brass key tagged in Timothy Blaine's round hand. Front till. Secret. Dawes's breath hitched, a greedy child's sound. He pocketed the key. Then, from within his coat, he drew something else, a small wooden shoe, red paint scuffed and flaking. He tested the heel with his thumb. It came away in a chip. He frowned and dropped the shoe back into straw with faint distaste. "Did you catch that? Miss Marple might have whispered to you. A man uninterested in a doll's piece, so his hunt is for papers and keys, not curiosities. The curse is convenient theatre. The ledgers of the play." She watched him bind the papers again, then hesitate. Conscience or calculation? Before tucking the bundle back deep and prizing up a second slat to make a new cavity, he slipped in a decoy, brown parcel paper scribbled 18 to 10s over shop twine. If found, it would point to petty trade, not title deeds. A poor magician's misdirection, but village eyes often love the obvious. A floorboard creaked above. Dawes started, knocked the lantern. It tilted, light skittered. The flame licked at an old droplet of wax along the metal rim, flared, and then, mercifully, settled. Dawes swore in a hiss, clapped his bandaged hand to steady it, and in doing so pressed the cloth into soot. When he drew back, a fresh smear darkened the bandage, coal, and a dot of blood. He slipped past Miss Marple like a draught and went up. She waited, listening to his careful relocking of the back door, to the quiet, lengthened strides heading for the lane, to the pause where a man checks himself for being seen. Then she moved. Upstairs, the shop seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple crossed to the counter, lifted the till drawer by habit, and smiled a little at the tiny ridge along its underside, just where a hand groping blind might rub. She felt for the shape the key would seek and found instead a neat, cunning groove the width of a teapot shard. So that was how the first hiding place had been prized. A noise at the front shattered the hush. The bell, an outraged chirp in the dead hour. Miss Marple turned in time to see the door jerk, stutter, and then open under a second key.
A figure slid in, smaller, swifter.
The lantern's ghost light caught a profile, sharp, anxious, and the glimmer of
spectacles.
The newcomer hurried to the counter, lifted the till with practiced fingers, and froze. The drawer would not give. With a soft, frustrated sound, the figure produced a different tool, not a blade, but a curved bit of porcelain, the lip of a teapot lid, glazed cream and crazed with hairline cracks. Miss Marple drew breath, but before she could step forward, the shop erupted. The constable at the corner, roused by the bell, crashed in from the street, Inspector Graves from the alley, and the figure at the till sprang like a startle of birds. The porcelain slipped, struck the counter, and shattered. The intruder dashed for the door, colliding solidly with Graves's shoulder. "Got you," he barked, seizing an arm. The spectacles clattered. A cap fell back, and Lucy Blaine stared up at them, face white with terror, breath shivering in the lamplight. "Who do you suspect now?" The village seemed to whisper at the window panes, their own reflections wide-eyed. "Lucy Blaine," Graves said, incredulous but inexorable. "You are under arrest." "Wait," Miss Marple said, very calm, very clear, as the constable reached for Lucy's wrists. "Before you do that, Inspector, kindly look at her hands." Lucy's gloves were off. Her palms, lifted helplessly, were spotless. No wax, no soot, No blood, only a small, unmistakable smear of something pale at the base of the thumb. Not wax at all this time, but a dab of lanolin cream with a recognizable scent. Rose, not lavender. Miss Marple's voice was softer than steam rising. And now ask yourselves, who in St. Mary Mead walks at night with lavender on his buttons and soot on his bandage, and who has only rose-scented hands and a teapot shard borrowed from her aunt's kitchen? A silence fell, heavy as a curtain. From the alley outside, hurried steps returned, 2 sets, and a breathless voice called, "Inspector!"
"Mr. Dawes, he's running toward the post office." Cliffhanger, Inspector Graves, spins for the door.
Miss Marple lifts the broken porcelain from the floor, and Lucy, shaking, whispers, "He told me to come," before the night swallows the rest. Chapter 7. All threads entwined, morning made amends for the night's excitements with a watery sun that tried, at least, to be cheerful. The Crown's snug, commandeered by Inspector Graves, became a little court. Scrubbed tables, a blackboard pressed into service for notes, and chairs set in a modest semicircle. Miss Marple arrived with her knitting and the air of a lady calling on the vicarage, calm, punctual, respectable. It is difficult to quarrel with a woman whose teapot is in the right, and whose shawl sits squarely on her shoulders. The assembly that mattered was small. Lucy Blaine, pale but stubborn. Reverend Pritchard, earnest and uncomfortable. Mr. Dawes, outwardly composed yet tight at the mouth. Mrs. Hartnell, present by inescapable gravity. And Sergeant Evans, with his ears, notebook, and incorruptible pencil. A chair stood empty for Dr. Rowley, detained at a confinement. Another for Mrs. Price Ridley, detained by herself. Inspector Graves tapped the chalk. "We shall have order," he said. Not because he expected it, but because the word itself can work little magic. "Miss Marple has asked to set out the facts as she sees them." "Facts," Miss Marple echoed pleasantly, seating herself by the fire. "They are much like socks, Inspector. One must pair them sensibly, or you will wander about with odd feet. We have, I think, 4 that keep recurring: a broken teapot lid, a missing letter, candle wax, and muddy footprints. Shall we see which sock belongs to which?" Mrs. Hartnell sniffed.
"I should think it plain enough that the doll—" "Dear Mrs. Hartnell," Miss Marple said gently, "the doll is a curtain. Someone tugged it hard to distract us." "Let us look for a moment at hands rather than puppets." She threaded a needle through the wool and began, in the tone of a lady recalling parish fetes. "First the teapot lid was found broken on the Toyshop step. Now lids do not leap to their deaths. They are dropped, knocked, or pressed too hard, doing the wrong job. There was a gouge in a crate in the cellar, and another last night, a crescent mark that would match the curve of a ceramic edge used for prizing. A person without a blade to hand might snatch what lay nearest, the lid of a kitchen teapot. Why would anyone break a teapot lid? Because the crate did not open nicely. Graves wrote, "Lid lever." "Second, the missing letter," Miss Marple went on softly. "We now know it conveyed Mr. Blaine's intention to bequeath the shop to his niece. Half-burned scraps were found in the cellar. A blue envelope corner lay by the church wall. Someone had reason to intercept, reason to delay, and reason to destroy, unless needed as leverage. People who live among letters," she added mildly, "sometimes forget how loudly envelopes can speak. You, listening, who do you suspect now? Interception is a craft, opportunity a timetable. Did you catch the detail that the postmaster sorts every hand that passes through St. Mary Mead? Third, Miss Marple said, candle wax. A pretty scent of lavender smudges this business, on a counter, by a church keyhole, on a button rim, and faintly in the cellar. Lavender is not church wax. It is parlour wax, private, domestic, useful to test wards and hide small sounds. It clings to gloves. It clung once to Miss Lucy's glove, but last night her palms smelled of rose cream alone.
Lavender clung also to a certain large button, fallen in the cellar. Graves chalked, wax, lavender parlour. Fourth, Miss Marple continued, muddy footprints which go in bravely and come out apologetically. They were planted, I believe, early on, an amateur theatre trick. Later we saw less of that pantomime.
Instead, we saw habit, a bandaged hand returning, a crate prized the same way, a sheaf of papers sought with the assurance of someone who had already found such things before. Lucy drew a breath.
Mr. Dawes runs the post. He could— Let us not hurry, Miss Marple said kindly. There is also Henry Larkin, the sexton, knocked down. There is talk of a doll to keep the village fearful. There is a vicarage hedge that caught twine smelling of paraffin and lavender.
And there are wheelbarrow ruts that tell their own small tale, Reverend Pritchard reddened. If you suppose, my dear Reverend, Miss Marple soothed, your barrow carried firewood on the wrong day.
The twine blew from the lane and caught, as twine loves to do. One ought not to tidy gardens on Thursdays, she added, for the sake of alibis. The room managed a breath of laughter. She turned to Lucy. My child, you went to the shop last night because someone told you to, did you not? Lucy's fingers knit themselves together.
He sent a note, she whispered.
Saying there were papers hidden and that I must come quickly. That if I could lift the till, if I had something thin to lever, it would be safe for me in the morning. Who sent the note? Graves demanded. Lucy shook her head. It was pushed under my door.
No name? Hand?
Miss Marple inquired. Lucy hesitated. Square, heavy, the letters pressed hard. But I can't be sure. Miss Blaine was decoyed, Miss Marple said. A very old trick. Send the innocent in first to make the noise that draws the watch, while the practised hand works elsewhere. And indeed, while you, Inspector, had your eyes on Lucy, the back alley received a different visitor. Graves's moustache twitched grimly. Who, Miss Marple? Why, the same who has visited the cellar before, Miss Marple said, her voice mild. A man with a missing button and a bandaged hand. A man who has spoken loudly of debts, so that we would not notice silence where it mattered.
A man who knows when the late post arrives, which letters are blue, and how to slip a corner under a church wall to make us think of vicarages and boxes. Mr. Dawes's jaw worked once, twice. This is monstrous, he said hoarsely.
Conjecture spun into slander, is it? Miss Marple's eyes were kind. Then let us not rely on conjecture. Let us ask instead why the doll was stolen. Dolls do not cash checks. But a story about a haunted doll that can explain why a man returns to a murder scene, why doors are tested at odd hours, why a figure runs across the green, cradling something child-sized. Everyone stares at the red shoes. No one looks at the till rail, the crate slats, or the little brass key marked front till. Secret. Graves's head jerked.
You saw a key? In the cellar, Miss Marple said simply.
A prudent person might have removed it. But a more useful thing was to watch where it went. Keys, like gossip, prefer their friends.
This one, I think, had a destination already chosen. She let the words cool like scones on a rack.
Consider motive, she resumed. Mr. Blaine intended to will the shop to Lucy. That ends a certain arrangement. Small loans advanced, receipts tided over, favours noted in private ledgers. If the shop changes hands cleanly, old debts must be called in or written off. If the will can be delayed, if the original destroyed and the witness line torn away, why then uncertainty reigns, and a creditor may squeeze and threaten and perhaps secure a lien before the law wakes. Who do you suspect now? The room itself seemed to breathe. Did you catch the detail about the witness line ripped from the will? Who in the village would be an ever-present witness, unremarkable in the corner where signatures happen? Who knows the look of a blue solicitor's envelope from 10 paces? Miss Marple looked into the fire as if it were a photograph developing. The first night, she said, our intruder blundered. A lantern licked an old wax droplet.
A hand was cut.
Blood dabbed a stair. The second night, the same hand returned with a bandage and a better plan. Send Lucy to the front as noise, slip in at the back for papers. But habit betrayed him. He prized the same crate and took the same bundle to inspect, then tucked in a decoy of parcel paper and sums. "Lest you find it and think the worst a matter of petty trade," she turned to Reverend Pritchard, kindly as a schoolmistress. "You, sir, were useful as a shadow, keys and church doors and moral worry. But you were never the hand. Mrs. Hartnell, you have supplied us with supernatural smoke without which our thief would have had to breathe the clear air." "Thank you," Mrs. Hartnell preened, then remembered to be affronted. "I shall not be made an accessory to common theft," she declared, unconsciously accessorizing it with a flutter.
"Not common, I think," Miss Marple said gently.
"There was murder after all. Mr. Blaine died by a blow from behind. A man went to him with a letter problem, a money problem, and a fear of being cut off when Lucy's inheritance was fixed. There was a quarrel, or a cold decision, and a blunt edge to hand in a toy shop. The iron cash weight, perhaps, or the till's own bar. The rest, wax, footprints, dolls, came after." Inspector Graves closed his notebook.
"And the teapot lid, Miss Marple?" "Ah," she said, with that little inward nod of satisfaction that comes when the last stitch mates up.
The lid was cracked before. It was kept near the cellar steps with the tea things. It served for many small indignities, but the piece that remained was kept because it fit. "If you search the intruder's house," she added mildly, "you may find a shard with a crescent notch that answers exactly to the crate gouge." Mrs. Hartnell enjoyed a small, scandalized moan. "House! You cannot burst into a man's private kitchen on the word of a teapot." "Teapots," Miss Marple said, serene, "have more to say for themselves than one thinks." Graves stood. His face had the set of a man who has, against his preferences, found a mind he trusts. "Sergeant Evans," he said, "you will accompany me to the post office, quietly. We will ask Mr. Dawes for the coat missing its button and for any shards of pottery kept by his sink. We will also collect last night's ash from his stove." He turned to Lucy. "Miss Blaine, you will remain available." Dawes rose too, a stiff, mechanical motion.
"I will not be tried in an inn," he said, voice low.
"If you accuse me properly." Graves's reply was the clink of handcuffs staying in his pocket. "Not yet." Miss Marple gathered her knitting. "If I may offer one last small sock," she said, as if to round off a basket, "it is the matter of the doll's red shoe. A flake of its paint lay in the ash pan below. If more such flecks are found in the grate at the post office, we shall know that somebody thought to burn the doll piece by piece to end a tale he himself had started. Stories are troublesome when they begin to run their author. Why would anyone burn a doll?" Mrs. Hartnell demanded, fascinated in spite of herself. "Because dolls keep faces," Miss Marple murmured.
"And sometimes faces have seen too much." The room exhaled.
Outside, the village moved in its ordinary rhythms, the baker's bell, a bicycle's rattle, the wild domestic racket of rooks. In the snug, threads lay ready to be drawn tight. Graves nodded once to Miss Marple and strode for the door with the sergeant at his heels. Mr. Dawes followed, because to sit would be to concede. Lucy sat very still, as if stillness itself were a kind of prayer. Reverend Pritchard bowed his head. Miss Marple rose last. At the threshold, she paused and turned back, her eyes on Lucy's face.
"Courage," she said softly.
"When men do wrong, they arrange their own brambles. Truth will find the path." She stepped into the pale day and met, at the Crown steps, a panting telegraph boy with a buff envelope in his fist. "For Inspector Graves," he gasped. "Urgent. From Garrick and Hollis." Miss Marple took it with the easy authority of a woman whom telegraphs obey. She glanced at the seal, at the bold staccato hand, and at the single underlined word, showing through the thin paper, "Witness." Cliffhanger. At the post office door, Inspector Graves lifts Mr. Dawes's heavy coat from its peg to find a torn label and a crescent of glazed ceramic in the pocket, just as Miss Marple breaks the solicitor's telegram seal in the street and reads the name of the missing witness aloud. Chapter 8. The quiet confession. It was a pale afternoon, with lights slanting through the post office windows as if reluctant to illuminate what it found there. The counter, usually host to neat parcels and orderly stacks of letters, now bore Inspector Graves's notebook, Sergeant Evans's careful evidence packets, and, folded in Miss Marple's handkerchief, the shard of a broken teapot lid with its cruel crescent edge. Mr. Dawes stood by his pigeonholes, square jaw set, the look of a man who believes that stubbornness might yet serve in place of innocence. His heavy coat lay draped over a chair, and in its pocket Inspector Graves had already discovered what Miss Marple had foretold: a jagged fragment of glazed ceramic, cream and crazed with hairline cracks. "Looks very much like the missing piece of our lid," Graves said, turning the evidence in gloved hands.
And it answers exactly to the gouges in the cellar crate. Dawes's mouth tightened.
"Circumstance. You'll not hang a man on pottery." "Not on pottery alone," Miss Marple said gently. "But pottery, wax, paper and buttons all together, do make a rather tidy quilt." She seated herself primly on the edge of a straight-backed chair, knitting needles glinting as if to keep time with her words. "Let us gather our threads. First, the letter. Mr. Blaine's will, entrusted to Garrick and Hollis, sent in their unmistakable blue envelope. Who sees such envelopes first in this village? Why, the postmaster himself. A man in debt, desperate for leverage, intercepts the letter. He knows that if it reaches Mr. Blaine, or worse, if Lucy sees it, his hold on the shopkeeper will vanish. So the letter disappears. Later, half-burned fragments are found in the cellar, where someone sought to hide the evidence of its contents. Graves laid the charred scraps upon the counter, their edges whispering of fire. "Second, the candle wax," Miss Marple went on. "Lavender, not church beeswax, dripped by a man carrying tapers while working by night. We found smears on a button on a lock on the shop counter. Mr. Dawes, your own overcoat gave us away, its missing button lying in the cellar dust."
Rimmed with lavender wax, Dawes shifted,
his bandaged hand pressing against the pigeonholes. "Third," Miss Marple said softly, "the muddy footprints, boldly stamped as though to shout of guilt. But they only went inward, not out again." A pantomime. "You, sir, planted them to lead suspicion astray. Meanwhile you returned by quieter means, again and again, with your wax and your broken shard. You prized the crate, searched the till, hunted for the deed that would secure your debts. And when Timothy Blaine stood in your way, then came the moment of cruelty." Lucy gasped softly, her hand to her mouth. The Reverend closed his eyes. Miss Marple's needles paused, her voice lowered. "Mr. Blaine trusted you. He let you speak freely of loans and receipts. You struck him from behind quickly with the cash weight or bar at the counter. A blow too certain to be accident. You covered it clumsily, then spread distractions, footprints, wax, whispers of curses and dolls. Even sent Lucy a note, urging her to come at night with a teapot shard, so that when the trap was sprung, she would appear guilty. Did you think the village would condemn a frightened girl more swiftly than a respectable postmaster? You were quite right. Who do you suspect now?" The silence itself seemed to ask. "Did you catch the detail about the wax on the button? About the envelope corner at the churchyard wall?
About the red shoe flake in the ashes?"
Inspector Graves fixed Dawes with a grim stare. "You'd best speak." For a moment the man's square shoulders held firm. Then the bandaged hand trembled, and with it the whole brittle edifice. His words spilled harsh, unwilling. "I didn't mean to kill him."
"I meant only to frighten him."
"He said he'd put the shop to the girl, that I'd have to wait like the rest. I'd lent him more than I should, more than I could afford. If Lucy took it, I'd lose everything. He laughed at me, called it small sums. Small.
Small to him, maybe, but ruin to me. I only wanted the papers."
But he wouldn't hand them over, and—" His voice broke, then hardened. "One blow, that's all. He fell."
"And then I had no choice." Lucy hid her face in her hands.
The Reverend murmured a prayer. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. There is always a choice, Mr. Dawes. One may face ruin with dignity, or one may seize dishonour. You chose the latter.
And lies like wax do drip where they ought not, leaving trails even in the dark. Graves stepped forward, cuffs ready at last.
Mr. Dawes, you will come with us. The postmaster sagged, shoulders slumping as if the pigeonholes behind him had emptied of letters forever. That evening, the village drew a long breath of relief. Gossip fluttered, but now it had a perch. The greedy postmaster, the intercepted letter, the waxy trail that had seemed like ghostly mischief, but proved mere human failing. The doll, too, was recovered, abandoned in a sack at the back of Dawes's storeroom. Its red shoes, chipped and scuffed, glared up with painted defiance at the very idea of curses. Lucy inherited the toy shop after all. With time, laughter returned to its bow-fronted windows. Reverend Pritchard blessed the reopening. Mrs. Hartnell supplied her own sermon on the folly of men, and Inspector Graves declared that old ladies with knitting ought to be given honorary rank in the force. Miss Marple, for her part, sat in her neat parlour, shawl about her shoulders, needles clicking as calmly as ever. She looked up once, as if at a listener you cannot see. "Did you notice the clue in Chapter 2? She asked mildly. "The candle wax on the counter that ought not have been there? The little detail so many passed by? Such are the threads of life, my dears. We tug one, and the whole cloth reveals itself. Remember, evil is rarely the work of phantoms. It is the ordinary weaknesses of ordinary men. Greed, fear, a lie left to grow." She smiled, serene and knowing. "Now tell me, who did you suspect? And when did you first see the truth?" The kettle whistled softly in the kitchen, as if applauding the end of the tale. She turned to Lucy gently. "My dear, when did you last see your uncle?" Lucy swallowed. "After tea. He had a letter. He kept looking for it, and then he said perhaps it would come with the late post. He sent me home before dusk." "A missing letter?" Miss Marple said, almost to herself. "There is always a missing letter, just as there is always a misplaced pin or a button that refuses to lie flat. The world signals when we are not paying attention." She smiled, sweetly apologetic. "Forgive an old woman."
"I ramble. Do you know what the letter concerned?"
Inspector Graves asked briskly. Lucy hesitated, and there for an instant something tightened in her face.
"He didn't say," Mrs. Hartnell pounced. "Because it was about money, no doubt. Or about that old toy collection. Or the niece's inheritance," she added with relish. "Mrs. Hartnell," the Reverend said warningly. But Lucy had flinched.
In her gloved hand the little nick caught. She reached to tug it down, and her palm flashed again, that telltale pale smear.
Candle grease, or something like it. Could it be face cream?
Possibly. Soap residue? Perhaps. And yet why was the wax smear on the counter so fresh that the inspector's pencil had picked up a trace? "Who do you suspect now?" you might ask, mindful of human weaknesses. The angry postmaster with debts? The niece with undisclosed knowledge? The vicar to whom men's secrets sometimes drift like fallen leaves?
Or the gossip who knows too much and therefore nothing at all?
The day drew in. The shop's lamps were lit. The toy's glass eyes caught the glow as if awakening. Inspector Graves began to usher everyone out. "We'll secure the premises," he said. "Miss Blaine, you'd better not stay alone."
"Reverend, see she's got somewhere sensible to go." "I can take her," Mrs. Hartnell offered.
With the magnanimity of a crow offering shelter to a sparrow in a draughty loft. "I shall be quite all right," Lucy insisted in a small voice. "I'll go to Aunt Em's." "Good," Miss Marple said, gathering her knitting. "And I shall pop in on my way home to see Mrs. Price Ridley about a jumper pattern. One must keep busy on such evenings." Evening fell like a velvet shawl about the village shoulders. The last customers of the day, curiosity, fear, speculation, drifted home. Inspector Graves stationed the sergeant at the back lane and took the front himself, with a constable to mind the lock. Later. How much later? No one could say with certainty. The quiet was punctured by a thin cry and the frantic scrabble of shoes across the cobbles. Miss Marple, who had taken a detour past the green, turned at once. Inspector Graves lifted his torch. The sergeant half fell through the back door. The cry had come from the alley that ran behind the toy shop. Lucy Blaine stood there, wild-eyed, her gloved hands pressed to her mouth.
"It's gone," she gasped. "I only came to look in the window. Truly I did. I couldn't sleep. And then I heard a tap, as if something fell and what has gone?"
Graves demanded, already moving. "The wooden doll," Lucy whispered. "The old one. The one with the painted red shoes."
"It was in the window, and now it isn't." Miss Marple felt the hair along her neck lift, like tea leaves rising in a heated pot.
A missing letter, a broken teapot lid, candle wax where it ought not be, muddy footprints that performed for an audience, and now a vanished doll. Who would steal a toy from a murder scene? She asked quite gently, so that only the night could hear. And why, after all this, would they come back for it? She turned slowly to the window pane. In the lamplight, a smear had formed along the lower edge, as if a damp glove had brushed it. Beneath the glass, something tiny glittered. One last pearly speck, a tear-shaped drop of wax. Who do you suspect now? The night seemed to breathe. The village, holding its breath, did not answer. Inside the toy shop, the toys did not stir. But somewhere, not far, a church clock began to chime the hour, and the sound pushed the evening forward into whatever waited next.